Hello, and welcome to the next instalment of looking at how we need a completely new look at the ancient history of the Near East and the chronology and dating that goes with it. My name is Ross Broadstock from the Britain's Hidden History group, and this presentation is about this fascinating, mysterious era that's been invented, and it's called the Ancient Dark Ages. The idea is this is usually placed towards around about the 1170s BC, that for some reason all these amazing civilizations just suddenly came to a stop. Some people thought it was a cataclysm, some thought it was a breakdown in trade, or natural disasters, all sorts of reasons. People have made whole careers talking about this, and some say it's a combination of events. And the official narrative is that for about 500 to 600 years, absolutely nothing happened in that whole region. It's caused all sorts of problems. There's been despairing archaeologists from Anatolia, for example, saying, "Wow, it's amazing, all this stuff, we've got nothing at all." Even one said even the worms don't seem to have turned the soil for 500 years. And the way you have to think of it backwards, the reason is it's all to do with the dating. None of these people have actually thought, hang on a second, this is ridiculous. You can't have 500 years of just the whole of civilization grinding to a halt and nothing happening at all. No, buildings, no crockery, nothing. We must have the dates wrong. And if you trace it back, the dating is all hooked onto the Egyptian dating, which has been known for years. It's based loosely on some writings of Manetho back in the day, and they were scraps and tatters, as the British Museum described them. There's no proper written history, a narrative, and this whole idea of dynasties and gaps and archaism and all that, it's absolute chaos. I mean, this has been commented on, way back. So Isaac Newton spotted these problems, as does many other historians since. And Alan Wilson and Blackett, if you look at their book Moses in the Hieroglyphs particularly, it explains how whole dynasties have been duplicated. A lot of mysteries disappear, where this idea of archaism, for example, where you would have a later dynasty deciding for no apparent reason to suddenly copy the complete lifestyles, dress, art, everything of a dynasty 1,000 years before or 800 years before, which would explain the same stories and pictures being duplicated, whereas in effect it's the same. It's the same dynasty in two different places. So what you need to do, once you start looking at that dating and you take out this gap of about 550 years, all these things like the mysterious sea people, they disappear, not required. They're perfectly well explained. There is no gap and everything works. And it all seems to come back to ancient times where the Greeks were very intent on proving that they had a very ancient civilization and that they were one of the oldest civilizations in the Mediterranean. This is very important to them. And the dates seem to be made to match, which put them out of line with British records, Roman records, Hebrew, Frank. More and more information is coming out of Ethiopia and Anatolia. None of them match, but for some reason, the Egyptian history is sacrosanct, even though it's a mess. So everything gets hooked onto those dates. So if you find something similar in a place to something you can date in Egypt, you then apply the Egyptian date. So of course this creates massive problems when the dates are wrong by so many years. So what I'm going to do here is something about this introduction to the subject, which is from Wilson and Blackett, the Trojan War of 650 BC. On page 18, I'm going to jump around slightly and just to stick to one point. And this talks about the 550-year Greek gap, as they call it. So I'm reading now from the book. There is an extraordinary timidity amongst the university community when they are confronted with the obvious fallacies and clear inventions in the Greek accounts of ancient history. The plain fact is that around 350 BC to 200 AD, a series of hugely incorrect theories were established and which have never ever been seriously challenged or properly questioned. We are told that the priest Manetho wrote a history of Egypt around 225 BC, and that this forms the basis of convoluted ancient Egyptian historical chronology. Well, Manetho was purportedly writing about events with beginnings variously dated at 4490 BC and 3150 BC, several millennia before his time, and with no possibility of checks being made on the validity of Manetho's assertions. The writer becomes critical when we take into account the fact that this history written by Manetho no longer exists, and there is no record of it existing for at least 1,650 years. It can and it does get worse, as Flavius Josephus was apparently quoting from Manetho's history, or a copy of that history, around 80 AD, some 305 years after it was allegedly written, and the format of Egyptian history laid out by Josephus bears no resemblance to the current accepted scheme. Africanus then allegedly quoted from Manetho around AD 160, some 385 years later, and Eusebius allegedly quoted from Manetho's works around AD 325, some 550 years after it was allegedly written. So surprisingly, the accounts of Josephus, Africanus and Eusebius are in conflict with each other. And so not only do we have Manetho's alleged history, but only scraps of it. And these surviving alleged remnants, which date around 400 to 550 years after Manetho's time, then contradict each other. It is difficult to imagine a more uncertain and flimsy and untrustworthy situation on which to base the entire history of ancient Egypt, and then in turn to base and construct the entire corpus of all the ancient histories of all the ancient nations on this morass of quicksand that is allegedly attributed to Manetho. Remarkably, the work of the historian Censorius places the dawn of Egyptian dynasty at around 2150 BC, which coincides with the British historical ideas of the legendary flood taking place around 2150 BC, and both these sources are ignored. We have already dealt with the mind-boggling and indeed laughable speculations of Greek mathematicians in attempting to somehow date the Trojan War and arriving at incredible dates around 1334 to 1184 BC. That's on the last video if you haven't seen it. The Greeks appear to have been very anxious to appear to be seen as having a long and ancient history to match with the older civilizations. Their main claims to fame lay in warfare, beginning with the Trojan War and continuing with their internal struggles and their long and valorous wars against the Persians, their shoreline colonization of Asia Minor and lands around the Black Sea, and in Sicily and Italy and the Western Mediterranean, and all this culminating with the success of the Macedonian Alexander the Great and his successors. So they sought to exploit what they learned from the scholars in the ancient civilizations of Babylonia and Egypt and elsewhere, and it appears to become a matter of primary importance to try to elongate and stretch out Greek history as far backwards in time as was possible. A key factor in his cultural political campaign was to shift the date of the Trojan War from around 660 BC back to around 1200 BC. This is what created the 550-year gap in the chronological timescale of all ancient histories around the Near East and Middle East, and university scholars and other experts have been falling over themselves in all directions to try to accommodate this obvious Greek falsehood ever since. The currently accepted and totally unproven and completely unfounded theory is that after the great Greek triumph in the destruction of Troy in Western Asia Minor, that at the very peak of their power, the entire corpus of the Greek states all fell into a strange miasma and an inexplicable dark age, of which there is no record at all. It is worth repeating that the notion that for 550 years the whole of Greece and all the nations of Asia Minor, with all their nations, cities, towns, lay under this utterly extraordinary and completely untrue period of total decline. There were no writings, no political activities, no military activities, no sculptures, no architecture, no developments of any kind. In fact, nothing whatsoever for 550 years. This is just as credible as the children's fairy tale where the beautiful sleeping princess lies in the lost castle behind the invisible fence in the enchanted forest until after 550 years the handsome young prince arrives to give her the kiss of love which awakens her back to life. It is impossible to understand how academic scholars can even contemplate such an era of total isolation and utter sterility. It all appears to stem from the Greek desire to be numbered amongst the more ancient nations and to deny their more recent origins and the risk of being labelled as barbarians. The chosen vehicle to accomplish this cultural and chronological transformation was the date of the Trojan War. This can be illustrated by quoting one modern author writing of two leading characters engaged in the Trojan War. And needless to say, this author accepts the theory of the 550 years of total oblivion without question. Mopsus, as Mopsus, was a Greek prince and military leader who led his own people to a new land after the war was over. He led an army from Colophon to Cilicia in Asia Minor, and there exists an inscription written in both Chaldean Hittite and Phoenician scripts, which names MPS or Mopsus as the person founding a ruling house. These modern discoveries made at Karatapa in Cilicia support the Greek legendary accounts of Mopsus marching from Colophon on the Aegean coast to found a new state. Interestingly, these inscriptions are rough dated to around 700 to 650 BC. This causes the traditional historian to write, explaining this. Quotes, "Thus, the Greek tradition of the migration of Mopsus in 1200 BC is neatly supported by a reference to him in Cilicia in the inscriptions 5 centuries later." Close quotes. So I'm adding this, they just basically push the inscription back 500 years. Or say it refers to an event 500 years earlier. It's bizarre the more you look into this. Absolutely bizarre. Anyway, continue with the book. On page 20 at the moment. This inflexible mindset is absolutely amazing. Evidence which clearly indicates that Greek history is factually correct and yet totally wrong chronologically is calmly accepted as correct in all respects without question. The assumption is that old Mopsus was somehow remembered and honoured some 550 years later after he had founded a local dynasty, when the whole matter raises the question of whether Mopsus was misdated at around 1200 BC, when he actually lived around 650 BC, and perhaps he died a little later. The same situation arises in relation to a reference to a Greek king named as Agamemnon, who is universally recognised as the king who led the armies against the Trojans at the siege of Troy. Again, the problem lies with the chronology. And did Agamemnon fight around 650 BC? Or did he fight around 1200 BC? The people of Cumma and Smyrna claimed to be descended from Agamemnon, and King Midas of Phrygia is recorded as having made an alliance with Agamemnon of Sema, and also to have dedicated a throne at Delphi. The point is that King Midas is dated at around 700 to 650 BC, and this then serves to date Agamemnon associated with Cumma. This again brings matters to the realm of fairy tales. This is what we're presented with. Two separate Agamemnons, one living around 1200 BC and the other living around 650 BC. Surely these matters need investigation. A merchant of the city of Cumma, called Midocritus, meaning approved by Midas, imported tin from the Tin Island in the west, which appears to indicate Britain. As the city of Cumma, assisted by Chalcis, was actively founding its satellite colony, also known as Kema, the first Greek western colony at the site of New Cumma, that is the Cumae of Virgil and Cuma in Greek, in the Bay of Naples in Italy around 700 BC, this may be relevant. Chalcis was famous as a metalworking city and was referred to by some as the Bronze Town. And bronze cannot be made without tin. Everything about this episode points towards a trade agreement between Agamemnon and Midas. And this enterprise of perhaps around 700 to 650 BC, with the tin and bronze trade forming the basis of the fabled wealth of King Midas. Doubtless, Agamemnon obtained his share of the profits from these trading ventures. So, do we have one Mopsos or two Mopsos? Or a strange 550-year-old remembrance of one Mopsos who lived in 1200 BC as another Mopsos of around 650 BC? Do we have one untraceable Agamemnon of around 1200 BC? Or do we have two Agamemnons? Or do we just have one Agamemnon of around 700 to 650 BC? This is only the beginning of a series of Trojan War dual personages. The salient point is that once this fantasy 550-year dark age is removed from Greece and Asia Minor, then all the current massive chronological problems disappear. Everything begins to match up correctly, and events begin to fit and knit together as they should. It is a simple choice. Keep the Trojan War at circa 1200 BC and maintain chronological chaos and academic frustration, or alternatively place the Trojan War at around 660 to 650 BC and restore chronological harmony and allow progress to be made. It is conveniently forgotten that the arrival in Britain of the Cymric nation took place around 504 BC, and the fleets that assembled at the island of Lesbos sailed in that year. It is therefore forgotten that the fleets were led by Burth, or Brutus, the great-grandson of the Prince Aeneas of Troy. This lineage makes a date of sometime between 1334-1135 BC for the Trojan War an impossibility. It is unacceptable to discard the whole authentic, accurate and provable ancient history of the British nation in order to preserve the quite ludicrous, unsupported dates claimed by Greek authors. I'm just going to jump ahead slightly to page 29 to finish the chapter. Several other advantages are gained by placing the Trojan War into its correct time frame, as all Hittite history falls into a correct order, and the strange 500 years of nothingness that disfigures all the various ancient histories of the kingdoms of Asia Minor and Greece disappear. All through the histories of the nations around the Mediterranean and the Near East, there are weird, inexplicable time gaps of hundreds of years, where no one lived or died, and nothing was built or made, and everything stood still and empty, in the form of fairy tale or Rip Van Winkle dreamland. Then suddenly, after an era of 500 to 650 years, everything restarted, as if the empty centuries had never been. Resolute authors like the prolific Immanuel Velikovsky in the 1950s and 60s, and later the archaeologist Peter James, with his collaborators I.G. Thorpe, Nikos Kokkinos, Robert Morcott and John Frankish, all identified Egypt as the source of these massive chronological problems, as did David Rohl. The works of all these authors were steadfastly ignored, and Velikovsky was vilified by the guilty academic establishment. None of them quite got to the answers, as they were all unaware of the potent mass of evidence in Britain and the marvellous weapons available in the ancient British Cymric language and alphabet. All these researchers have all very clearly seen that there is a massive chronological problem, and that the cause of this huge timescale distortion lies in defective ancient Egyptian history. The academic establishment has compounded the problem of adopting a clearly incorrect synthetic model of imaginary Egyptian ancient history by attempting to conceal their adherence to a defective historical scenario, by conspiring to defraud the public who pay for the universities and museums, by distorting the radiocarbon-14 laboratory test results with an unsupported formula of divide the result by 80 and then multiply the new figure by 100. It's cooking the books. The task is to bring together all the apparently divergent, corrected, tangled pieces of Egyptian, Hittite, and Greek histories into a coherent pattern with the known and reliable Hebrew, Israel, Roman, and British ancient histories, and to note the king lists of the Franks. The task does not begin in Troy, but in distant places, elsewhere on the roads that lead to Troy, in circa 650 BC. So we can explore part of that and the connections with Britain. More importantly at this stage, just think, just stand back a second and think, does it make more sense that there was a strange period in history, and go look at lectures like Klein and people like that, it's very easy to find them on YouTube, where all over the Mediterranean, really, and Near East, everything just stopped for hundreds of years. Just stopped. You can't find any evidence, plots, nothing, complete absence of everything. Or is it more likely that the very fragmentary evidence that is available for Egyptian history was put together incorrectly and needs a serious re-evaluation? Please leave your comments, let me know what you think, and more coming up soon. Until the next time, Hervuch.